Stability can persist long after its foundations have vanished. Japan became the world's quiet laboratory for that illusion. For decades, growth slowed, debts expanded, and money was created without apparent consequence. Each intervention promised control, each extension postponed reckoning. Markets adapted, citizens adjusted. The system learned to survive without healing. What looked like resilience was endurance under artificial conditions, maintained by repetition rather than renewal. This story is not about crisis arriving suddenly. It is about a nation proving that collapse does not always explode. Sometimes it stretches, absorbs pressure, and teaches the world how long imbalance can be sustained. Modern economies are taught to equate stability with growth, inflation with overheating, and monetary expansion with temporary emergency. Japan inverted each assumption. Stability persisted without growth. Inflation disappeared despite unprecedented monetary accommodation. Emergency policy became routine. The system did not collapse because it redefined what survival meant. Instead of restoring productive momentum, policy shifted toward preventing visible failure. The objective quietly moved from renewal to continuity. At the center of this inversion was a financial architecture designed to absorb stress indefinitely. Low interest rates were no longer a stimulus but a permanent condition. Government debt ceased to function as a constraint and became an internal circulation mechanism. Savings flowed into instruments whose purpose was preservation rather than return. Risk was not eliminated. It was institutionalized and spread across time. Losses were delayed, diluted, and socialized through balance sheets that no longer reflected market discipline. This inversion created a new definition of success. Avoiding crisis replaced generating growth. Price stability replaced income expansion. Employment continuity replaced productivity gains. The economy stopped signaling danger through inflation or defaults and instead communicated through stagnation. What appeared calm was not balance, but suspension. The system remained upright because it was constantly supported, not because it was self-sustaining. Japan's case matters because it reveals how modern systems adapt when correction becomes politically and socially intolerable, rather than allowing contraction. The framework bends rules, stretches mandates, and reinterprets outcomes. Stability becomes an administrative achievement rather than an organic result. In that process, the meaning of money, debt, and time itself is altered. The inversion does not announce collapse. It disguises it as management. This redefinition sets the stage for understanding why endurance can masquerade as health, and why systems optimized for survival often sacrifice the capacity to truly recover over extended historical horizons of decline. Japan's prolonged monetary expansion did not fail because it was poorly executed. It failed because it addressed symptoms while reinforcing the structure that produced them. The core mechanism was overextension without liquidation. Capital remained locked inside institutions, sectors, and balance sheets that no longer generated proportional returns. Instead of being cleared, inefficiencies were preserved. This created an economy that functioned, but did not regenerate. The first layer of the mechanism was misallocation. Cheap and abundant money reduced the cost of delay. Unproductive enterprises survived not through innovation, but through access. Financial institutions rolled obligations forward rather than forcing resolution. Resources flowed toward preservation rather than experimentation. Over time, this suppressed creative destruction, the process through which systems renew themselves. What was lost was not capita, time, B, then 0.3s, but dynamism. The second layer was financialization. As productive opportunities weakened, activity shifted toward balance sheet management. Returns were engineered through leverage, duration, and policy expectation rather than output. The economy became increasingly sensitive to interest rate, signaling, and central intervention. Price discovery weakened. Market feedback loops slowed. When signals arrive late, corrections arrive larger. Japan avoided abrupt corrections by extending the delay indefinitely. The third layer was temporal distortion. Monetary expansion allowed the present to borrow stability from the future. Debt accumulation replaced income growth. Demographic decline reduced labor pressure but increased dependency. Each year of postponement required larger interventions to maintain the same surface calm. The system learned to function only under continuous support. Withdrawal became unthinkable because normal conditions no longer existed. Crucially, this mechanism did not produce immediate collapse. It produced endurance under constraint. The economy adapted to low expectations. Households adjusted consumption. Institutions adjusted targets. Risk tolerance fell, but dependency rose. This is why the mechanism is difficult to detect. There is no singular breaking point. Instead, capacity erodes quietly. Collapse, in this context, is not a moment. It is a process where optionality disappears. The system loses the ability to respond to shock because all responses have already been used. Flexibility is consumed maintaining equilibrium. When strain eventually exceeds management capacity, adjustment no longer arrives gradually. It arrives without tools remaining. Japan's experience demonstrates how a system can appear stable while exhausting its future responses in the present, turning survival into a long, controlled descent rather than an immediate failure. Japan's monetary trajectory is often treated as an anomaly, but history suggests it is a variation on a familiar pattern. When systems reach the limits of organic expansion, they rarely contract willingly. They search for methods to preserve existing structures, even when those structures no longer justify their scale. Across different eras, the tools change, but the logic remains consistent. One recurring blueprint appears in late imperial systems, where fiscal demands outpace productive capacity. As returns diminish, authorities prioritize continuity over correction. Obligations accumulated during periods of expansion cannot be unwound without social and political cost. Instead of reduction, substitution occurs. New mechanisms are introduced to sustain old commitments. The result is not collapse, but extension. In early modern Europe, heavily indebted states postponed adjustment through monetary debasement and forced lending. Coins retained their face value while losing substance. Trade continued. Governments functioned. The system did not fail immediately. It lingered, increasingly dependent on confidence rather than output. What ultimately changed was not the presence of money, but its relationship to real activity. Value drifted from production toward administration. A similar pattern emerged in the 20th century when industrial economies confronted post-war saturation. Growth slowed, but institutional promises remained. Rather than renegotiate expectations, systems absorbed pressure through credit expansion. Monetary flexibility replaced fiscal restraint. This allowed stability to persist while productivity gains weakened. The surface remained calm, but structural tension accumulated beneath it. Japan fits precisely into this blueprint. After its asset bubble collapsed, the choice was not between growth and contraction. It was between visible disruption and managed endurance. The decision favored endurance. Monetary policy became the primary instrument for smoothing imbalance. Interest rates were compressed. Debt issuance expanded. The adjustment process stretched across decades instead of years. What history shows is that these systems rarely collapse from excess money alone. They decline when the gap between obligation and capacity becomes unbridgeable. As long as institutions can refinance, roll forward, and reinterpret success, the system continues. The danger lies in the gradual loss of responsiveness. Each layer of intervention reduces the margin for error. Historical precedents also reveal why these periods feel deceptively stable. Inflation does not always signal distress. Defaults are not required for failure. Societies adapt to lower expectations. Political pressure shifts toward preservation. Over time, stagnation becomes normalized. The system survives by lowering its definition of success. Japan's blueprint is therefore not unique, but unusually extended. It demonstrates how modern monetary tools can stretch the late stage of a system far longer than past examples. By removing immediate penalties, they allow imbalance to persist without revolt or panic. History suggests this endurance does not resolve contradictions. It delays them. The longer the delay, the fewer paths remain when adjustment finally occurs. Japan stands not as an exception to historical decline, but as its most refined modern expression. The pattern Japan followed did not unfold randomly. It progressed through recognizable stages that appear whenever a system attempts to preserve scale after momentum has vanished. Each stage reduced volatility while increasing dependence. Each solution narrowed future choices. The first stage was shock absorption. After the asset bubble collapsed, the immediate priority was preventing cascading failure. Banks were stabilized. Credit channels were protected. Losses were contained within institutional balance sheets rather than transmitted outward. This stage succeeded in its narrow objective. Panic was avoided. Confidence was preserved. But resolution was deferred. The system chose insulation over cleansing. The second stage was normalization of emergency measures. What began as temporary accommodation became structural policy. Interest rates remained suppressed. Liquidity provisions expanded. Market actors adjusted behavior to the expectation of continued support. Risk premiums compressed, not because risk diminished, but because intervention was assumed. At this stage, incentives quietly shifted. Survival replaced performance as the primary objective. The third stage was behavioral adaptation. Households reduced consumption growth and increased savings. Firms limited expansion and focused on balance sheet resilience. Innovation slowed, not from lack of capability, but from lack of reward. Returns no longer justified risk. The economy adjusted to a lower growth equilibrium without overt disruption. This adaptation stabilized outcomes while eroding dynamism. The fourth stage was institutional entrenchment. Financial and governmental structures reorganized around persistence rather than progress. Debt management became a central function of policy. Refinancing replaced repayment. Success was measured by continuity of service, not improvement. Markets stopped disciplining inefficiency because exit was no longer permitted. The system grew increasingly inward-facing. The fifth stage was time substitution. Future growth was implicitly borrowed to sustain present stability. Demographic decline intensified this effect. Fewer workers supported expanding obligations. Rather than restructure commitments, the system extended duration. Longer maturities, larger balance sheets, and deeper intervention replaced productivity gains. Time itself became the primary resource consumed. The sixth stage was illusion of permanence. After years of stability, the absence of crisis was mistaken for proof of sustainability. Each year, without collapse, reinforced confidence in the model. The system appeared to validate itself through endurance. Yet resilience was not generated internally. It was maintained through continuous external input. Removal of support would not return normality. It would expose how dependent equilibrium had become. The final stage was fragility through rigidity. Time, year, and 0.5s. By eliminating short-term volatility, the system lost flexibility. Adjustments that once occurred incrementally were no longer possible. Policy tools were already deployed. Margins were thin. Any new shock would encounter a system optimized for stasis, not adaptation. This is the paradox of prolonged stabilization. The longer imbalance is managed, the more disruptive eventual change becomes. Japan's experience illustrates this full sequence without interruption. Each stage appeared rational in isolation. Together, they formed a path where survival crowded out renewal. The pattern does not predict sudden collapse. It predicts constrained outcomes. When choice disappears, events dictate direction. The system remains intact, but only within a narrowing corridor. That corridor defines the true cost of attempting to print stability indefinitely. Japan's experience no longer belongs solely to its own history. The conditions that defined its monetary experiments have begun to appear elsewhere, not as imitation, but as convergence. When growth slows, populations age, and political tolerance for disruption declines, systems drift toward similar solutions. What once looked extreme now appears familiar. Time, .5s. Modern financial systems increasingly rely on sustained accommodation to preserve stability. Interest rates are treated as instruments of reassurance rather than price signals. Asset markets respond less to fundamentals and more to expectations of intervention. Debt expands not because confidence is high, but because alternatives are limited. Japan revealed that these dynamics can persist far longer than theory predicted, provided institutions are willing to absorb the consequences. The alignment begins with incentives. Governments facing structural constraints prefer policies that avoid visible contraction. Central banks are tasked with smoothing outcomes rather than enforcing disciplines. Time, 0.5s. Markets adapt by internalizing support as a baseline condition. Risk is not removed. It is postponed and distributed across balance sheets that grow opaque over time. This mirrors Japan's transition from market correction to managed endurance. Demographics reinforce this alignment. Aging populations reduce labor growth and suppress consumption expansion. Productivity gains become harder to generate organically. Under these conditions, monetary expansion compensates for missing momentum. Japan demonstrated that low inflation can coexist with aggressive balance sheet growth when demand remains subdued. This combination challenges traditional warning signals and delays recognition of strain. Institutional credibility also plays a role. Systems with strong domestic savings, regulatory coherence, and social cohesion can sustain prolonged adjustment without revolt. Japan benefited from these buffers. Other advanced economies increasingly share similar characteristics. Stability is maintained through trust in institutions rather than economic acceleration. This trust allows policies that would otherwise trigger resistance. What aligns most closely is the redefinition of success. Growth becomes optional. Stability becomes paramount. Avoiding collapse becomes the primary metric. This alignment does not require identical outcomes. It requires identical priorities. Once preservation outweighs renewal, the system follows a narrow path. Japan's lesson is not that monetary expansion guarantees safety. It is that safety can be prolonged at the cost of flexibility. Modern systems adopting similar frameworks inherit both advantages and risks. The advantage is time. The risk is dependency. When endurance replaces regeneration, the system becomes resilient to small shocks and vulnerable to large ones. Alignment does not imply repetition in detail. It implies repetition in structure. Japan serves as the clearest completed segment of a process others are entering. Time 0.5s. Its relevance lies not in prediction, but in demonstration. It shows how far a system can be carried by policy before policy becomes the system itself. That boundary, once crossed, reshapes the meaning of stability in the modern financial era. Acceleration begins when a system exhausts its ability to delay adjustment. In Japan's case, this zone was not defined by a single shock, but by cumulative constraint. Policy tools remained available, but their marginal effect diminished. Each intervention stabilized conditions less effectively than the last. The system required increasing effort to produce the same outward cali. Time 0.5s. The trigger zone emerges when flexibility disappears. Interest rates cannot be reduced meaningfully without distorting financial institutions. Balance sheets cannot expand without undermining confidence in their permanence. Fiscal coordination becomes necessary, but politically sensitive. At this stage, management replaces choice. Responses are no longer evaluated by effectiveness, but by necessity. Action is taken because inaction is perceived as unacceptable, even when outcomes are uncertain. Acceleration is often misunderstood as crisis. In reality, it appears as normalization of extreme measures. What once signaled emergency becomes routine. Markets adjust expectations accordingly. Volatility compresses further, masking internal stress. This compression is deceptive. It concentrates pressure rather than dispersing it. When movement finally occurs, it does so across a larger surface. Japan's trigger zone is defined by dependency rather than panic. Institutions function because support is assumed to persist. Any deviation threatens not collapse, but discontinuity. This makes adjustment politically and socially costly. The system becomes locked into its own maintenance. Acceleration, therefore, time 0.3s is not a rush toward failure. It is a narrowing of acceptable outcomes. The danger of this zone lies in external shock interacting with internal rigidity. Shocks that would once be absorbed now test the limits of management. Responses must be larger, faster, and more coordinated. Error tolerance shrinks. Timing becomes critical. In such conditions, stability depends less on economic strength and more on confidence in continuity. Japan illustrates that acceleration does not announce itself dramatically. It advances quietly as policy becomes reflex. The trigger is not an event, but a conditio. Time ada 0.5s. When systems reach this zone, change remains possible, but only in constrained forms. The path forward is no longer chosen. It is inherited. The consequences of prolonged monetary endurance are unevenly distributed. Households experience stability without advancement. Income remains predictable, but opportunity narrows. Savings preserve nominal value, yet yield little progress. Younger generations inherit a system that functions, but offers fewer paths for mobility. The cost is not collapse, but compression of possibility. Institutions become both protected and constrained. Financial entities survive through policy alignment rather than performance. Governments maintain service continuity while accumulating obligations that cannot be unwound without disruption. Exposure shifts from sudden failure to gradual limitation. Risk no longer appears as crisis. It appears as permanence. Those most exposed are not participants in markets, but participants in time. As adjustment is delayed, future capacity is consumed. Choices available today are paid for by reduced options tomorrow. The system remains intact, but its horizon shortens. Stability becomes a ceiling rather than a foundation. This is the hidden exposure of endurance. What is preserved is order. What is lost is trajectory. Japan did not disprove the limits of money. It redefined how those limits are encountered. By extending adjustment across decades, the system demonstrated that collapse is not always explosive. It can be managed, stretched, and normalized. This endurance, however, carries a cost that accumulates silently. Stability achieved through constant intervention trades flexibility for time. When policy becomes the structure, correction loses meaning. History shows that systems rarely fail because they lack tools. They fail because those tools are exhausted maintaining equilibrium. Japan's experiment reveals that sequence matters more than timing. The question is not whether adjustment arrives, but how much capacity remains when it does.